about having a slow computer is it's a little unclear when we're live. Because, yeah, is it live? Are we live? I think we're live. It says we're live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my Almost Dead channel. This is Danny Duchamp. I'm sure a couple of you might maybe remember me. I am joined here by TheSwolosopher, not to be confused with the Philosopher. He's also known as Christian on some platforms. Christian, why don't you introduce yourself better than I can do so?
That's pretty much me, actually. I'm Christian. I co-host Disenthrall with Patrick Smith. Probably a few of you guys maybe have seen me there, big things I've done with actually a lot of the stuff I've done has been with Patrick, which is kind of why we wound up teaming up. But I guess biggest thing that I've written co-written was the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto with Patrick, which is kind of like a broad meta-ethical and down from meta-ethical claims to normative applied ethics. And that's, basically the biggest contribution I think I've done to this point. But I'm here as a person interested in having good conversations, and thanks for having me.
No worries. And to lower people into the context slightly here, we were discussing on Twitter, talking about all of the good things that Twitter's usually used for, philosophy, right? That's the main thing people talk about there. Sorry, X. We were just talking before the stream. I'm gonna get that name right. Sorry, Elon. Please don't ban me. And the general concept of intuitionism, phenomenal conservatism, the Michael Humerian ideas that people who are familiar with what I do might have heard of before, or are just familiar with Michael Humer. The basic question is there evidence for morality? I thought that I should probably post the Patrick Smith tweet that brought this all up, so I just put it there on the side. But basically it reads, as yet there has been no discovery of normative evidence. Such a thing has not been shown to exist. I'm running out of new ways to say this. Without it, you have no basis for any flavor of natural law, nor arguments about normative, performative contradictions. So, yeah, just a claim that there is no evidence for morality. So, Christian, just so I can get your position clearly on here, so you'd say that there isn't any evidence for morality, that normative claims there isn't any kind of physical evidence that we can back them up with, right?
Yeah, so I would consider myself a moral anti-realist in the sense that I don't think any sort of naturalistic moral claim is actually speaking to some facts about reality. This isn't to say I'm some kind of moral nihilist. I think there are still ways that we can a little bit have our cake and eat it too, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we go on. But that, I think, as far as my sentiment regarding the original post, yeah, I would say Patrick is correct in stating that, at least to the extent that there has been no evidence that I have seen provided to me up to this point.
Okay, just a quick point on the technical side of things. We have just lost your video a few times during this. If you could just flick that off and on, I'm sure that would help.
Sure.
Yeah, that got you back. Thanks.
Cool.
Okay, so the basic Humerian response to that position. Actually, before we get into that, why doesn't that make you a moral nihilist? Because one would assume that if you're of the belief that beliefs should be justified by evidence, and yet there is no evidence for moral claims, that would mean that you are a moral nihilist. You don't think that any moral claims are true. Is that accurate? Or I assume not. Why not?
Yeah, so I've been trying really hard to figure out which pre-existing label fits my thoughts the closest, and I think just to get people in the right headspace, I don't think this is 100% accurate, but you could say it as I subscribe to a kind of constructivist morality. I think the way that we use moral language indicates that we're looking for certain kinds of things when we talk about establishing an ethical theory. And one of these is that it prescribes non-contradictory, or rather non-mutually exclusive behaviors. Same thing, but some people like one or the other. In order to set behavioral standards for a given group to achieve a certain kind of end. in that sense, what we can do is we can give what little reality does give us and build upwards. So we can have essentially, the argument of the anti-subjectivist manifesto is that if you apply this to the limit, this kind of standard for modeling moral systems, then what you get is essentially the principle of consent as the highest moral good, or whatever you would call the highest moral good. It fits the template of what ethics is designed to do the best, least arbitrarily, least subjectively. And
Gotcha.
yeah. So again, I think I don't like using terms like good and evil, obviously, because I don't believe the way that they're often used comport to anything in reality. But I think that there are ways that we can, without abandoning the moral language that we use today, we can still come up with rules of engagement with each other, essentially, that fit the bill. So.
Okay. So there's a few things that I could say about that, but the first one I want to get at is you're talking essentially about what morality is designed to do. There's a certain implication of question begging there, because designed to do implies that you're attempting to accomplish some goal. If you're attempting to accomplish some goal, presumably you have a reason to do that. It feels as though if you're going to say, this is what you should do because it's what morality is for, well, why should we have a morality for that, right? Like, what? You're talking about a function. Surely you need a reason before you can have, like, a function like that, or at least a purpose, right? Saying something designed for is implying a purpose, is it not?
Oh yeah, and we completely bite the bullet on this. The fundamental premise of all ethics in a world where there is no moral fact grounding any of this, no universal compulsion or something like that, it has to be an arbitrary selection. You have to choose that you want, for whatever reason. You say these moral guidelines. It could even be, just to get a little bit ahead of ourselves, it could just be that you think it seems the nicest way to live your life. That is a completely valid justification for initiating the process.
Okay.
Once you get from there, it seems to be the case that ethics kind of demands a certain set of criterion that you adhere to.
So that is a little bit ambiguous as to whether you'd say that morality is subjective or objective, because you seem to be saying that, well, I just arbitrarily decide that this seems like the way I want to live my life, and from there I construct my moral theory, right? This moral theory will or will not successfully help me to live my the life, the kind of life I want to live. Would you say that morality is subjective or objective, first of all?
I would say that it is ultimately subjective. Like I said, on the basis level, you have to arbitrarily choose. You're not going to be like, and I know you don't believe this either, but just for the sake of clarity, you're not going to get like hit by a lightning bolt.
Yeah.
Nature itself will not smite you. I don't believe that there's some like force, and I'm not saying you believe in any of these things, but just to get in the headspace that compels you one way or another, or some underlying fact of the reality. You have to choose that, and because of what ethics is, because of what it is designed to accomplish, that should lead you towards certain conclusions. So that's kind of the. I feel like, not to say the same thing 20 times, but I think
Yeah.
that's kind of
Yeah. All right. Now, there was in that original thread some indication that you thought that there was friction between this view and like an ethical intuitionism view, where just to give people a little bit of background on where I'm coming from. This is the view of Michael Huemer. It's based on a concept called phenomenal conservatism. The idea is that what fundamentally grounds your beliefs is some intuition that something is the case. You get some idea that something is the case. It seems that way to you, and that is where you start from. It's best understood as a contrast to skepticism. So it's philosophical skepticism. This isn't just like the idea of being, careful about what you believe. It's the philosophical skepticism. Rene Descartes, we refuse to believe anything until we have sufficient reason and evidence to justify that belief. Whereas phenomenal conservatism is no, we assume things are the way they seem unless there's a reason to believe that they're otherwise. Um, and once you take that different way of approaching things, there's certain moral facts that appear to be very obvious, right? It seems incredibly obvious that Jeffrey Dahmer's murders were wrong, right? It's important to note that that's a specific case one and not a general case one, because the general cases we construct out of the specific cases. And so when we see Jeffrey Dahmer's murders and they are very obviously wrong, that's very obviously immoral, we assume that that is the case, that they are immoral. And then we see if we can find any consistency between the sorts of things that seem to be obviously immoral. And we construct theories based on that consistency. If there are inconsistencies, it also seems obvious to us that inconsistencies are incorrect. Like if if there's a contradiction in your logic, it seems to me that that would defeat that logic, or it would defeat the conclusion, or at least the justification for that conclusion. And so the concept is that seeing as how it seems to us that certain things are moral and certain things are immoral, that by default is the case, then we test them for consistency. Or can we see patterns to what seems moral and immoral to us? And it turns out, yes, we can. We sometimes get a rough approximation of them, like saying that murder is wrong, right? But then, we might even say killing is wrong, and that is a very rough approximation because it turns out that sometimes it seems like it is right, but we get better and better by specifying it more and more. The same way that we would look at physical laws. We have certain impressions that we're seeing things. You might get the impression that you're seeing me on your screen with this an enormous amount of video glitches, as it seems to be. And you would thereby see if that is consistent with a whole bunch of other experiences, right? Is it plausible? Like, oh, I've seen people on video screens before, or at least I've had the impression that I have. I kind of have an idea of how this might work. I've got like functions that could result in this, so it all kind of matches up, and you have like a somewhat consistent understanding that all sort of works together. And thereby you say that, okay, it seems to me that this is the case. It all seems to function with my other seemings, so I'm going to assume that it is the case unless I find some defeater, some reason to think it's not the case. So that's the basics of moral intuitionism, phenomenal conservatism. Do you have a specific issue with that? Would you say you're sure you disagree with it? You might disagree with it. Where's your approach to that?
Well, I'm hesitant to say I'm sure I disagree with it because there's always a chance I might have some kind of misconception. But I asked a lot of questions in that Twitter thread, so I think I'll just try to be more direct with some of my concerns, and maybe we can move from there. It seems to me the case. I have to watch how I use those terms in this conversation. That moral intuitionism, specifically phenomenal conservatism, has two major hurdles for me. And the first one that Humer does a lot of time addressing in his book, unfortunately for me sufficiently, but we're having a talk here, is evaluating contradictory seemings. And the second one is post-evaluating contradictory seemings, sufficiently bridging the gap from belief to what some people would call actionable knowledge or true knowledge, if you would prefer that. And I think there's a conversation we could have where I'll just go ahead and extend an olive branch. I think phenomenal conservatism does a great job of explaining how what we might call, and this is not to be condescending, but sometimes this term is used in philosophy, like folk epistemology is often done in the way that phenomenal conservatism is. I hold a lot of beliefs, very tenuous perhaps, but all the way from tenuous to probably pretty strong beliefs that are grounded in seemings. I would not consider them to be entirely justified in themselves. Something like, I don't know, that this water bottle is plastic. I've seen a lot of other things that I was told were plastic, but I've never done like a chemical analysis on any of this stuff to know for certain in like a truly justified fashion, like an Aristotelian sense, that this is in fact a plastic water bottle here. And so, yeah, I'm totally willing to concede that. Yeah, I guess I'll stop talking. What are your thoughts on those two objections that I had?
Yeah, so you're thinking that it is how people often do form their beliefs, and it can give you some beliefs, but that it's not all encompassing. That we also have more rigorous, philosophically grounded beliefs that are based on some, like maybe some first principles reasoning up or something like that. That we should be more confident, and we should be more confident about those beliefs than the ones that are based on seemings. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that would be fair.
Okay, so I think that my task then is to try to attack the better beliefs, because I think that there are none. I think that all of your beliefs must, if they're justified, will essentially be based in seemings ultimately. And to do that, I did a video about phenomenal conservatism called "Why I Left the Skeptic Community and Became a Conservative," which I liked the title because it made people watch it thinking it was something completely different. But in any case, the skeptical position going to Rene Descartes would tend to be, okay, let's figure out what we can actually know for sure, for certain, reasoning up with logic. And I think that that approach actually yields no beliefs. Even I think, therefore I am. I think that that's not actually justified if you assume the skeptical position, which is beliefs should not be held unless there is sufficient justification, like reason or evidence for them. And the reason is that just the same as Descartes doubts the outside world, he says, well, you know, my senses could be fooled by some evil demon, and he's really controlling me and telling me, giving me these false impressions of the world around me. Just the same, humans also make mistakes logically, right? Like, it seems ridiculous to us to think that, well, I'm thinking, I must exist in order to think, therefore I exist. It seems ridiculous to say we could make a mistake there. It would not seem so ridiculous if there were 7,000 steps to that logical progression, right? If I wrote out a logical argument and there were 7,000 steps, right? It either 100% either follows or it doesn't. But you can't quite be sure, right? Maybe you made a mistake somewhere along there. And the result there is that it seems ridiculous to you, I think, that you could make a mistake with a couple of steps of logic. But it seems ridiculous. That's my starting point, right? That's the phenomenal conservative starting point. That's not the skeptical one. You should be able to justify it from first principles that really you did not make a logical mistake when you were determining that cogito ergo sum. So how can you really have some seeming free justification for belief?
Yeah, so this is we could look at this. This is shares a lot of similarities to like Hume's critique of reason. I'm not sure if that's directly where you were pulling from or not, but he
Not
has
quite.
like a very similar concern. He has a very similar concern about our ability to justify our capacity for reasoning. And there's been since then, as one of the most influential writers in human history, there's been a lot of commentary on how we can or cannot bridge this gap. And I think I one of my big things that I want to make sure I do here is I don't want to undermine seemings to the point of epistemic uselessness. I don't think they are. But for example, something like a big defense of Descartes, especially in like contemporary philosophy, because Descartes has received a lot of criticism from individuals like Nietzsche. You know, he's very famous for saying, you can't say I think, you could say something thinks, but the I is a concept that in itself requires grounding. A lot of responses to that have been based in what we would consider a seeming in immanent experience. And this immanent experience is supposed to be like an almost transcendentally true facet of our experience, contextually speaking. So this is going to be an important concept going forward in this conversation. But I think seemings are true statements contextualized about a person. So if you want to say, let's just do, I think, therefore I am, right? Like I am having an immanent experience. It seems to be the case that I'm having an immanent experience of reality. Thoughts are going through my head. Things are happening. Therefore I must be something, right? Is grounded in what I will completely concede is an immanent seeming. However, it is necessary for the conclusions that we're experiencing to be true that it is the case. And so we could say that we could say that the immanent nature itself is a seeming, but because there can be no other possible solution, we could be brains in jars, we could be computer programs, we could be all these other things. The fact that we're having these thoughts necessarily implies that we exist, rather than, or even vice versa. Actually, if we were to somehow have a seeming without a thought, even it would necessarily, or if we were to somehow seem existence without a thought, it would be like, oh wow, how did I do that? I must have had a thought in order to seem that I existed.
Yeah.
So I don't want to remove seemings entirely. My goal here is not to say like seemings are awful and terrible and that they should never be involved in epistemology, but that some things kind of transcend the seeming that they're based on. And I'm sure we'll get more into this later. I have a lot of controversial opinions about our epistemology that kind of come out of this view. So
Interesting. Okay. I think the point I want to get into on that was where you said that it's necessarily the case that for us to have this seeming, something must exist. So this is why I'm not just doing sort of the I needs justifications. Or we can really only say something thinks. What I'm doing is different. You could even say that no, nothing thinks, right? And my point here is not to say that this is actually something that I believe. I'm not like so nihilistic that I think that we can't really know anything. My point is just that if we really take philosophical skepticism seriously, I don't think we can justify any beliefs at all. So you said that like something must exist in order to have the seeming. Well, I agree, it seems to me that something must exist in order to have this seeming. But again, that is really just that's just a seeming itself, is it not? Like, how are you getting that conclusion that, something must exist in order for it to have a seeming?
there's an argument you could make that it's almost analytically true, like definitionally speaking.
It seems it
Um,
is.
if what do you mean when you say that? It seems it
Well,
is.
so, okay, the experience that I have of determining something as analytically necessary, right, like, is that I will see some logical conclusion, like, if A, then B, A, therefore B. It the experience that I have is that seems really solid. It seems like, yeah, that must be true. That's the experience that I'm having. It is an experience, right? That's something that seems that way to us. I don't see, if you're going to really hold to philosophical skepticism, it seems to me as though you're still relying on a seeming, that feeling of like this logically has to be the case, right? That sense of not cognitive dissonance, but cognitive concordance that you get when something seems logically the case.
So I was thinking about talking about this a little bit later, but maybe now's the perfect time, since we're at this like very low level epistemology right now. Like, oh, I think therefore I am level. Um, it seems I've got to watch that. Sure, why not? It seems to be the case that if we're to do this kind of analysis, just like you were doing just there, that we risk kind of devolving into like a reducto ad absurdum of seemings. So okay, I
I
think
am
therefore I
making a
am
reductio
seems to be
argument.
the case.
Just want to jump in there really quickly. Like, I'm totally accepting that I'm making a reductio ad absurdum argument. That is the point I'm making.
Okay, so just to make sure, you think it's seemings all the way down.
Yeah.
Okay. Do I want to? Why not? It's the thread that we're on right now. Cognitively, how do we process through an absurd level of seemings like that? How do we seem to seem to seem to seem to seem to seem to seem all the way down?
Right. Well, we don't. We get a seeming, right? I think that maybe I shouldn't have said it's seemings all the way down, because that implies that it's like it's based on something, based on something, based on something. It isn't. And actually, the important point about seemings and phenomenal conservatism and ethical intuitionism is that we actually don't base things on first principles. We base things on the final case. Like that, the point that Michael Huemer often makes, and just a quick side point here, my position is not the same as Michael Huemer's, and so if he were to ever hear this, I'm not claiming that this is his actual position. This is my position, which is heavily influenced by him. So anyone who's saying I'm getting his position wrong, like not trying to get his position exactly right, but influenced by it, he talks about the the Jeffrey Dahmer case, right? That is where we base our morality on. It's not that we come to some logical conclusion that it is wrong to violate consent, and then we analyze that this situation violates consent. Rather, we look at the specific cases, and we get so many specific cases that seem to follow a similar pattern that we create the general rule based off the specific cases. It's not that I have a seeming that Jeffrey Dahmer is his murders were wrong, and that is based upon some other seeming. No, it's just that seeming. That's the starting point that I have. It seems to me that that Jeffrey Dahmer's murders are wrong. Right? That's just the way it seems.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm on the same page, to shift this from the moral context into epistemology, just more distinctly,
Sure.
like let's say I observe what my first interaction with a rock, right? And let's say, for the sake of this, let's say I have some kind of, I don't want to say innate, because that seems a little, we can get maybe into that a little bit later. But I see this thing and I go, wow, that's sure got this rockness about it. I'm really seeming that rock right now. And then I see another one and I go, wow, that also really seems like a rock. And I see a bunch of these. And when I bring them all together, I can say they're okay, well, these have all of these same kind of characteristics. And I am therefore justified in lumping them all together with these independent seemings into this broader kind that we're going to call rocks.
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. I mean, in that one, it's more our categorization of things rather than an understanding of the world itself. I would say that an example would be more along the lines of like if a thing that you might think is a first principle, like a logical law, that or actually maybe a mathematical one, right? That the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, right? What that is a result of is not Euclid's principles, where he derives these things from first principles. What more likely happened there is that people had found that this was a constant thing, and then had used those results that they'd seen over and over again, and found some consistent principles that seemed to explain it. Right? It's they did not come to the conclusion from the first principles. Rather, they found the original principles from the commonly noticing that the angles added up to 180 degrees.
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost sounds like a kind of constructive empiricism. If you've ever heard this term, and like for anybody who doesn't know, this is like a scientific anti-realism position where it's essentially like, hey, we're not going to commit ourselves to hypothetical entities. We're just going to we're going to subscribe to that which best explains the observable world that we have direct access to. Well, some access to. They would not say direct access. Some access to. And so what's interesting about this is that I don't think there's anything wrong with saying like, hey, a bunch of people before Euclid realized some very basic things about triangles. Like people have been building stuff way before Euclid and applying these principles, whether or not they knew it. There's just something about these shapes that was useful to them. And it seemed that they were appropriate for the structures that they were building, whether it was a roof or a bridge or a road, whatever it may be. I think just I don't think I want to commit myself to Euclid. I definitely don't, because at least one of them is not true in all cases. But what are the postulates? But I think you could make a case to say that, hey, you're kind of doing this backwards. Like, yeah, it's fine to say that have we have discovered these in reverse order. We realized some things, that triangles were useful, and they have these certain kinds of properties, and then we found out a language in mathematics to talk about them in a different way, effectively, rather than discovering something innate about reality. But without that kind of innateness of triangles already existing, would it be the case that we could have done any of the things that led us to those conclusions? So, like, if it was not the case that, two parallel, that's the worst example. Let's say, I just said not to use that one. For anybody who doesn't know, Euclid's parallel postulates is the whole reason we have non-Euclidean geometry right now. But take like, I think the third postulate is like the one
Yeah.
about connecting two points. The shortest path will always be like a straight line or something like that. Cartographers, I'm sure, or road makers, I'm sure, realized this long before there was any kind of mathematical proof of it. And I think some people would say that the reason that they had that seeming is because it speaks to something uh, innate, and they couldn't justify it at the time, but now we have the capacity to do so with this mathematical understanding of the world.
Okay. So I think that the disconnect between our views might have come right at the very end, where
The
you said
justification.
justification. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think that coming up with the general principle justifies the initial belief. I think the consistencies of the repeated, high level beliefs, that's what justifies the general conclusion. The general principle. The general principle is useful because it often explains these seemings that we have. It's not that the seemings can be shown to be true because they conform with the general principle. That being said, once we do construct a general principle, I do think that you can go back the other way, because by rejecting that general principle, you're also it loses parsimony with all of those other beliefs, right? All of those other seemings, right? If you have if you see, I struggle to think of an example off the top of my head, but I'll just keep it in abstract terms. If you see a whole lot of things that point you to a general law, and then you see an exception to that general law, there's some good reason to believe that that exception, oh, I must have been mistaken about that exception, because like it seems unlikely that all of those other ones would have led me to this general law, and then just this one is like out of the way. It probably could have just been a mistake on my part. Now, if you see enough of them, you might say, okay, maybe I just screwed up in making the general law. But nonetheless, the point is that in the first place, what justifies the general law is not some first principle reasoning, it's that it often explains what we seem to observe.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, that definitely tracks with phenomenal conservatism. I think this might be a good time, actually, for me to kind of focus in on one of the initial critiques that I brought up, and that's about the validation of competing seemings. And I think justification is a tool that, in, well, we could say classical or folk epistemology, is something that we often use to evaluate between one claim and another. Whether or not this is actually valid, we'll leave that to the end of the conversation, but I think this is how it is most often done, for the reason that it is very easy and often to hold beliefs that may and or may not be the case without some experience that an individual has, but justification for that is a way of communicating it and grounding it in something other than your own individual perception. And, just to expound a little bit, remember briefly that I talked about this idea that I think seemings are true contextualized in all cases. So if I say, it seems to me that I am perceiving a Bucky's cup right now, there's nothing you could say to me that makes that not true. There's no defeater that you could provide to me that I am not seeing a Bucky's cup right now. Whether or not the Bucky's cup exists, whether or not it's actually a 7-Eleven cup, these are things that we could talk about. But what I am seeing before me in an incontrovertible sort of way is that there is a Bucky's cup. Now, the problem is that if we disagree with this, There's no way I can transplant the seeming in my brain over to you that gets us on the same wavelength. You would have to be having the same exact imminent experience as me in order to make that determination. And we can't do that. We're in two distinct contexts.
Mhm.
So, how would we resolve a disagreement like this? Like, let's say you're convinced we're both looking at this cup, and I'll be the one who's wrong in real life. I'll say this is a 7-Eleven cup. You say it's a Bucky's cup, and we're just our seemings are completely different. Um, how would we go about evaluating the seemings?
If our seemings are completely different, then if you actually looked at that cup and I looked at that cup and you are claiming to see a 7-Eleven cup or whatever it was, I would probably say that you're lying because I've observed people lying before, right? Because part of the question there that you asked was, how do we resolve that? Maybe we can't. Sometimes people disagree, and whilst like there are situations where two people believe different things, they're both justified in believing what they believe, even though those things are contradictory, right? Just because like all beliefs are to some degree probabilistic, or at least most of them. I'll be less controversial and say most of them are, and I think most people agree with that. So most beliefs are probabilistic. If I shuffle a deck of cards and I draw the top card, I can see what it is, and so therefore I would have a strong belief that it's, I don't know, the Three of Hearts. You would not be you would be justified in believing that it's not the Three of Hearts, that it's literally any other card, right? So that's a situation where two of us have justified beliefs. You believe it's not the Three of Hearts, right? Or to the extent you'd be willing to bet money on it, right? Unless I tell you, then maybe you believe. But let's say we haven't talked about it. You would be of the belief that it's not the Three of Hearts. I'd be of the belief that it is the Three of Hearts. We'd both be justified, even though our beliefs are incompatible. Like, do you agree with that so far?
I think that's fair.
Okay, so yeah, we can have beliefs that are contradictory, and both still be justified in it. So it might be the case that we can't come to a conclusion at all. Um, it might be the case that I am justified in believing that you're just lying. You're just telling me you see a 7-Eleven cup to fuck with me. Um, and that might be because I have seen 7-Eleven people look at. I've seen people lie before. I haven't seen a 7-Eleven cup that looks like a Bucky's cup from another angle. That seems crazy. Like, that's a less likely thing than you're just making it up to me. And that's because it conforms with all my other seemings better, right? That the idea that you're just making stuff up. So yeah, what about that?
Yeah, okay. That is definitely one option you could take, is to reject it. But I mean, there's two ways we could go here. I could press and say, like, okay, let's pretend I'm not lying and I genuinely see it. But I think, just to stop beating around the bush a little bit, I'm starting with a physical example for a conflict in seemings because I feel like it's the easiest, and you didn't take the bait, which was good. It's the easiest to say, well, the cup is right there. We can just, maybe show it to another person and they could externally validate it. Well, that seems to be like seeking for justification outside of the independent seeming. But you didn't go that way, and that's good. So the this becomes even trickier, and much more difficult to throw away, or not to undermine your argument, but to call out as lying, I feel, when we pull this back from the physical world. So let's and I don't think we have to search too hard for this, but let's look at culture, like just vastly different cultures. I'm not a relativist before we get into this, but I think it would be foolish of us to say that there are not distinct parts of the world with very distinct moral intuitions. Um, I so like let's take for example the treatment of homosexuals in the Middle East. Right, it's something that reporters love to talk about. It's probably a little overblown from what they say, but it happens nonetheless. Awful things like mutilation, throwing people off of roofs, etc. There are some number of people over there who believe that they're doing a good thing when they do that. I, on the other hand, believe that that is a distinctly bad thing, and that nobody should be thrown off of a roof for having a particular sexual preference. how would we, from the context of seemings, which if seemings are to ground all of these moral intuitions that we have, and those moral intuitions themselves, these seemings, not to conflate the terms too much because they are a little distinct, I think. But these seemings ground a type of moral realism. It seems to be the case that we have two, and it's okay. I understand the fact that it's very possible that one of them is wrong. How do we know who is wrong?
So there's two ways that I could approach that. There's the first way, which is to answer your question and say how I think we actually do bridge that gap and explain why they are objectively incorrect, which I think they are. However, I think that there's almost a more important response that I want to give first. And if you double down, I'll explain how I would actually bridge the gap. But the more important response is that it doesn't matter whether we can or not. There are disagreements people have about everything. Unless you're also going to say that there is similar subjectivity, or you're going to levy the same criticism about beliefs about whether the earth is flat, or beliefs about this or that, then this doesn't seem to be an argument against my position on ethics, because it seems exactly the same as how it works with anything else. Different cultures often have different beliefs about what is. Sometimes we can convince them just by showing them reasons and evidence and walking them through different thought experiments and things like that, or even like demonstrating something to them. Sometimes we can't, right? In that, I could have been talking about morality in that last couple of sentences, or I could have been talking about reality, right? So yeah, I can go through how I would answer your specific question if you want. I don't want to dodge, but I do want to point out that I don't see how this is any different from a claim about reality rather than morality.
Yeah, so I think here I'll do my best to convince you. Maybe I do think both are important, but I think they're important in different ways. Like if someone makes a seeming, my dog is a mixed breed dog, and let's say they're like, oh, you have a beautiful German Shepherd. It seems to be a German Shepherd. I could, try to go out of my way to come up with any sort of arguments to convince them. Otherwise, I don't really care that much. I'm like, yeah, he's probably some of that. Thanks. uh, I think there are definitely situations where it doesn't matter as much. Uh, my problem is that phenomenal conservatism, specifically moral intuitionism, is claiming a kind of moral realism in the sense that it is speaking about some sort of moral facts about reality. And if you're going to claim that you're speaking to moral facts and there is a possibility in which you are wrong about those facts, it seems to be the case that, just, and I haven't asked you on this directly or anything, but most moral realists believe that it's very important that they get those moral facts right because they are moral facts that ought to be guiding their behaviors inherently as moral facts in themselves. So when you're presented with a another person's seemings that seem to contradict your own, you have two options. Like you said, you could say, well, I'm probably right, but is that good enough to say you're probably right? First off, because you could be wrong still in that situation. And two, is there any way to know? And I think you kind of already answered that like maybe there isn't, but it's I'll let you go.
Okay. Um, I'm not sure I still quite see the response there. Like, are you saying that your criticism does work just as well against a claim about reality, right? Compared to morality, or are you saying that it claims about reality there are facts about reality, whereas there aren't about morality? And why does the fact that people disagree on morality mean that how is that an argument against the existence of moral facts any more than the fact that people disagree about reality is an argument against reality facts?
Yeah. So to be clear, at this exact moment, I'm not criticizing whether or not there is or are not moral facts. I guess I'm trying to figure out, how do you know you have the moral facts and don't have an incorrect seeming? So like, let's just give, for the sake of this part of the conversation, moral facts do exist. We have two people with competing seemings about, we'll say, a mutually exclusive moral fact. Like throwing gay people off of roofs is good, throwing gay people off of roofs is bad. You have two people with opposing seemings. It seems to be, not to retread too much ground, but it seems to be kind of implied in the concept of moral realism that these moral facts are important and we ought to comport our behaviors to them. Yet we have two people with a disagreement based on these seemings. And I'm trying to figure out how we evaluate to figure out, if I have a seeming that's wrong, I feel like I need to know about that. Like, let's, give it. Moral realism is true. I ought to know that because I'm not throwing gay people off roofs, and that's bad. And I need to start throwing them. I need to start chucking. This is a joke, by the way. But, that's kind of where I'm at. I'm trying to figure out what this process looks like.
Okay. I still don't quite see what the answer is there, like how you've differentiated facts about reality from facts about morality here, but maybe that'll become clear once I actually start answering your question more directly. So let me try to do that. How do we convince the roof throwers that they are morally incorrect?
Well, sorry, just a
Oh, yeah?
caveat real quick. Yeah, how would they convince you you're wrong? Either way, like at this moment, let's pretend like you've got a seeming and you're looking for defeaters, like a good person who holds seemings, and you're trying to make sure you've cataloged as many defeaters as possible. What would that look? Sorry, not to couch too much, but
That's
yeah.
good. Yeah. Well, it would be very difficult for me to come up with a defeater for my current belief because I believe it. There are, like, my belief that it is wrong to throw gays off the top of roofs is quite strong. I think there, like, I can see a few seemings in favor of every conclusion, but the seemings seem very weak, especially when combined with the logical structure that I have constructed from other seemings. So I would prefer to answer the question by explaining specifically how I'd try to convince them, because that I understand a lot better.
Okay.
So the way that I'd try to convince them might start from pointing out that presumably you think, okay, before I jump into this, are you an atheist?
Yeah.
You are? Okay, good.
Agnostic atheist. I use the annoying technical agnostic atheist, but yeah.
Sure. So, but if you were forced to bet, you wouldn't put money on there being a god.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the argument that I might have is that, like, okay, is it really true that it seems to you that you should throw gays off of buildings, or is it more that it seems to you you should obey God? Right? Because I think that the majority of them, or at least a lot of them, would say that it's like that. My fundamental belief, right, is that it's wrong to disobey God, right? That we should obey God, and so then now it's just an argument about whether God exists, right? So that's one way that I can do it. I can appeal to their other seemings. I can start talking about, okay, well, when you have like an omnipotent being, and I can do that whole, can God make a rock so big even he couldn't lift it, right? It seems like things follow a logical structure, right? Yeah, it seems to be the case. Like if A then B, like, normal logical structures. Okay, great. And it seems as though a being like that would violate those, doesn't it? Yeah, okay, well then there's some intuition now that I believe that if he's actually paying attention, I will have developed that, okay, maybe there isn't this omnipotent being. And if the idea of me throwing gays off of buildings was based on the idea that it's what this omnipotent being wants, then it kind of seems like that might have been a mistake, right? Doing the thing because this guy told me, it turns out there is no guy, right? That seems probably like a mistake to him now. So that's like a very rough, like, that short thing isn't going to convince him. It's obviously going to take a lot more, and it should. We build our belief systems out of an enormous number of seemings. But yeah, ultimately, It's going to be presenting him with things he already agrees with and showing how those seemings that he has in other areas come together to conflict with the seeming he has in this area. It would be exactly the same process if I was talking about a belief about morality or reality. Like there's zero difference in how I would approach that.
Okay, yeah, cool. It's interesting that you brought up God. I wasn't expecting that, but something that I noticed, and just to be clear before I say this again, this isn't a criticism against you or your particular belief directly, but it got me thinking, is that I've noticed over really the last year, I think as moral intuitionism as a whole has kind of gained some traction, which good for you guys. You have obviously very good marketing. um, the there has been a large number of Christians who have started taking the phenomenal conservative defense of God, and that they have a seeming that is extremely powerful, and essentially there's, not to up front load my criticisms, there's no defeater that you could present to them that would undermine their belief in God, which could be an issue, could not, we'll see. But this is, I think, the perfect example of what I'm talking about, as far as like you could propose this one alternative coherent structure of seemings that that goes into conflict with what they have. However, there is, and I think even as an atheist I have to accept that there's been a lot of work done in apologetics to build up coherent beliefs in a theistic God, whether or not there's something we believe could be justified. And I think that's one of the distinctions I make. And so, like, let's just say they like almost in a Kierkegaardian style, like completely bite all of the bullets. They're like, yeah, there's no way we could ever understand God in his totality. He's so far beyond us. But it seems to me the fact that he's real, I don't have to justify any of his qualities because he seems innately this thing. Therefore, his book is true. Therefore, throwing gay people off of buildings is good. And you could even stack onto it, and it even seems good while I do it. And I guess, I feel like we could do circles about this for a while, so maybe I'll take another step forward and we'll see where that goes from there. I am not sure how this gets us any further than just, well, maybe it gets us slightly further, but I'm not sure it makes a vastly meaningful step away from the epistemological swamp game, you could say, that skepticism places us in already. Because it seems to be the case that holding a belief based on a seeming gives you just as many reasons to believe that there could be defeaters you aren't aware of, or that your seeming is mistaken, as it does justification in itself. So we're kind of at like a neutral epistemic value at best.
Gotcha. So it doesn't seem that way to me. It seems to me, yeah, it seems to me that seemings give you at least. So there's a guy online that by the name of Bones the Rabbit. You may know him on Twitter, and he has this thing called Bones Law, which is there is no truth absent framework, and I think it's true. In order to have any sort of justified beliefs, you have to have some framework in which you're analyzing those beliefs. You have to have some starting point. My argument for phenomenal conservatism is not that we don't have to just like assume a starting point. You always have to just assume a starting point. Rather, it's that my starting point works, and I think skepticism, if followed consistently, does not. If followed consistently, does not. Man, there was a lot in what you just said before, and I'm not sure if I want to bring in a new point or if I just want to let you respond to that. And I think I'm going to do that. So the justification is not that we don't have to just start some with some basic framework, right? I'm just assuming that my seemings are valid. That is true.
So then, I guess. So if you're assuming, I'll even give you the benefit of the doubt and say that it seems to be the case that your seemings are true, right? That I feel like would maybe, unless you don't want to take that, but that would even
that
be
would
like
be circular.
It would, but I mean, is it any different than assuming like axiomatically that seemings are true?
Well, I mean, I'm just
not
saying
trying
that's
to
not. I
dog on
don't
you here,
think.
just to be clear.
I think that there's a difference between circular logic because I think that there's a sense in which you can't do circular logic because you can't do an infinite number of steps.
Right.
But you totally can just randomly assume something, right? There's no failure in your ability to do that. And so that's what I think I probably do, seeing as how I can't do the other thing, or it seems like I can't.
Okay, so I think man, how do I want to tackle that? That's interesting and a very I think a very strong and good claim. Uh good because it's strong, not weak and squirrely. I like those. The I think something that I really want to press on here is trying to keep what you're saying in mind, but I don't know if this really resolves my issue with the claim that it's not really developing us epistemologically. Because I feel like, how about this? Let's just a brief question. Is it the case that you can know for any certainty that a belief you hold there does not exist a defeater for it, a seeming that you hold? I'm sorry.
I mean, when something seems to me to be the case, I'm open to the possibility. But so I said before that all belief is probabilistic, and I think that that's true. Um, that's a whole other thing. I think that I'm happy to just say that most are, and just talk about the ones that are. Um, but yeah, so I think that it is possible that there is a defeater, but if something seems to me to be the case, then that means that I have not encountered sufficient defeaters to change my view. And if that seeming, I just take along with that well, if the seeming exists, then there must be a defeater. Then that wouldn't be a justified belief. But I don't assume that. I just it's something seems to be the case, and it's possible that there's a defeater. But until I find such a one, I think I'm justified in believing what seems to be the case.
So, wouldn't it be the case then that under the moral intuitionist framework, if we were to advocate for a moral realism based off of our seemings, it should be couched in language like murder is wrong, assuming I haven't missed anything?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean,
Now, I think this is,
can I just quickly? Aren't you
yeah.
always doing that? Like, assuming I haven't missed anything? Isn't that like, because if you've missed something, like even cogito ergo sum, as I pointed out before, I think therefore I am. I must exist in order to think, or something must exist in order to think, unless I've missed something. Because if you had missed something, then maybe that isn't true. You just think you haven't.
Well, I think there are people who use, and we could argue whether or not this is incorrect. I think that's how you should use it, but I think that bundles you up with the same skeptical baggage I was talking about earlier, where you can never commit yourself to a seeming to the extent that you would need in order to say that you are correct. There's always going to be this kind of before I go too far onto that, there are people, I've seen them speak, and again, we can argue about whether or not they're just wrong to say this, who believe that they have had a seeming of God that is so strong it is true. It is a true seeming. There exists no defeater that could undermine this seeming of God. They make that declarative statement. And I don't think there's anything saying they can't do that. I think they might be. I think they're wrong. I'll go ahead and say that. Cards on the table. But go ahead. Yeah.
I will go a step further. I think that they're lying.
You
Just the
think?
same way.
Okay.
Yeah, just the same way as when you say that the 7-Eleven. I see this Bucky's cup as a 7-Eleven cup. And it's like, well, maybe you actually do feel as though that does seem that way to you, and it's just maybe it looks different from a different angle, or something like that. It's just this. That seems really unlikely to me. It seems much more likely that no, you don't. Doesn't seem that way to you. You're just saying that, right? And similarly, I think that people who say that it just seems to me that there's God, that's the ultimate seeming. I think probably they don't. That being said, I will absolutely bite the bullet of if they really do have that seeming, and I'm not 100% sure they don't, I just suspect that that's not really how their brain works. Yeah, like if that really is this seeming that is so obvious to them that it seems more real than the world in front of them, then okay, yeah, they are justified in just believing that. I just don't think that that's the case.
Okay, so riddle me this then. What does moral intuitionism gain across, or as opposed to, say, just like a constructive, moral anti-realist position? What are we gaining and losing? Because they seem to be extremely similar positions as far as the consequences are concerned.
Um, a lot of these categorizations, I'm a little bit unsure about whether I want to say that I hold certain positions and which ones are different from which ones. Um, Look, if you don't see a difference between moral intuitionism and a anti-realist position, then okay. I do. I think that isn't moral intuition. I don't quite see how you see them as the same actually. So when you've got moral intuitionism, that's necessarily a moral realist position. How could that be the same as an anti-realist one?
So basically, maybe I'm wrong, but just to walk through the mock-up in my head, I
Okay.
see we've got two groups of people that have their moral intuitions, and they come up with some different set of rules for behavior across each other. We'll call them A and B, I guess, or A1 and B1, because there's going to be a second group. And A1 and B1 both have seemings that contradict one another, and they don't really have a method of resolving them, but that's fine. They get along enough that they can just live apart, right? And they can trade and they can do all these things. They just don't, they don't like live together because they have these disagreements. And then you've got A1 and B1 that don't, appeal to any sort of there being a moral truth in the moral realist sense, but they have these intuitions that they act on for A1 and B, or A2 and B2, that give them some contradictory positions, like um, but they still trade and they still get along, and maybe some intermarry and cross and move between two cities or whatever as time goes on. uh I don't really see a meaningful difference here, because in the first group, like, we can say that I don't want to sound like I'm just completely undermining it, but
Okay.
just say it how my head is seeming it. Seeming, why did I say it like that? My head is seeming it this way. um the difference between A1 and B1 is that they both believe that they are speaking to moral truths that very well could be irreconcilable. I think we can agree to that at this point. Whether or not they believe one side is lying, or whether or not they believe the other side has some coherency issues, or that they're ignoring some defeaters, etc. They both believe genuinely that they're speaking to some moral truth. And these other two genuinely believe that they have differences of opinion on how things should be done. And one side, they believe, has just their values in the wrong place, or aren't seeing the opportunities of the other side, and they can't really cross because they're both kind of speaking to what they like in that moment. It seems to be the case that there are not very many differences in this society, other than the kind of language that we're using, in the sense that morality is real and we can't reconcile that across disagreements, and morality isn't real and we don't need to try to reconcile that across disagreements, because we don't need to appeal to any real morality.
Okay. Maybe it would help if I go a little bit deeper into what I think that morality is. Because just the same as with a belief about anything else, a belief about morality starts, in my view, with some seeming that you will test for consistency with other seemings and judge based on that. That being said, there is something that that thing is, right? Ultimately, you will be able to um, explain what the thing is that you're talking about on a deeper level. What I think morality is a collection of different things that usually travel together, and thereby we can refer to it as one thing. Granted, I think that's what all things are. Um, Probably I will need to sort of just do a quick uh, explanation here. I'm sure you've heard explanations like this before, but just so we know what page I'm on. If I have my water bottle here. We define this as water bottle, and it is useful to do so because even though it's composed of multiple parts, the top and the canister here, if I move them, they move together. If I throw them, they'll still move together. They work together to perform a function of allowing me to drink some refreshing water. All those sorts of things. They're manufactured together, right? So it's useful to refer, even though we can separate them, we can understand that this part's this part and this part's this part. It's useful to call them just say a water bottle and refer to all of these sorts of things. It is arbitrary in one sense because we could very well say, oh, well, water bottle refers to all of these atoms here, plus the ones in this remote control. That's a water bottle. It's like that's not very useful because I move this around and this stays still. This has a completely different. These ones seem to have a completely different function, right? But you could. That's a totally coherent word, right? If water bottle just meant both of these things, all this stuff, then that would be entirely coherent as well. So what can happen, however, is once these things get separated, like these two parts and our part, we find that we are like this one goes over there and that one goes over there, and we say, where's the water bottle? And it's like, well, maybe it's over there because we're calling this one the water bottle now that they're separated, or maybe we'll say, well, it's broken in parts, it isn't anywhere, it's gone, or maybe we'd say this part's the water bottle. I don't know, probably this one. But in any case, that's a little arbitrary in the sense that you could define it otherwise than how we do, but it's non-arbitrary in the sense that there are certain useful ways to define things and certain less useful ways to define things. Similarly, morality, I think, is a bunch of things that usually travel together but don't always. So, for example, one thing that morality is that our methods for fulfilling values that also fulfill methods for fulfilling values that are about other values. So, for example, I not only care about acquiring money for myself, I also might like my friend to have money for himself, right? And so if there's some situation, like maybe I care about my money more than my friend's money, there'd be a situation where I'd be willing to take an action that lost me $1 but gained my friend $100, or something like that. And that's a situation where it's like I'm weighing up different values that I have that pertain to other values. And that does imply things like consent, right? Being moral. In that sense, if we're calling morality the fulfillment of values that pertain to other values, then consent would be moral, because when two people consent, then they both fulfill their values, right? Or else they would not have consented. And so from that perspective, that kind of morality would advocate for consent. On the other hand, there's other stuff that we might mean by morality. You could also, if you're a Christian, you could be referring to things that God commands, or you could, if you have some sort of like biological way of looking at morality, it's the things that allow for social cohesion and thus more reproductive fitness of the organisms that hold the genes for that kind of behavior, and that's morality. It's a lot of different things. What satisfies those different standards is very different in principle, but in practice, they're all really quite similar, and a lot of it's based on consent. And so what I think morality is, the reason that when we explain one of those things, why it doesn't seem like morality to us, it seems like, okay, but is there some fundamental reason it's right or wrong, is because we're separating the pieces of it. And we're saying, well, no, now it no longer seems like a water bottle. I mean, maybe it still does, but imagine it's like, broken into 1,000 pieces. It no longer seems like a water bottle. And it's like, yeah, but that's because you're only looking at one piece of it.
Okay, yeah. I like a lot of that. I think a lot of that resonates with me too. I like the composite view. Like morality is a composite object. I think a lot of the way that I try to present ethics is in a similar fashion where it's not like I think it's very not productive to try to boil these things down into like goodness and badness detectors. I think it's significantly more to, and I usually call these ethics just because I think it's easier for people to think about them as something a little bit more than just morality, but the two are honestly interchangeable. The
Yeah, I've seen some
yeah,
people trying to argue about whether they should be the same thing, and the funniest one is where they both agree that morality and ethics are different, but they have inverted views of which one means which
right.
thing.
Yeah. So just for my sake, when I say it, I mean it interchangeably. That's more just just filling in some boxes here. But just the way I look at ethics is that we have certain goals that we're trying to achieve, and a lot of people have a lot of similar goals that they're trying to achieve. And that I like a lot of what you said because specifically with the composite objects thing, because I believe 100%, like I said at the beginning of this, that choosing whether or not we're going to call this a water bottle is arbitrary. But there is a non-arbitrary best way to identify whatever I have in my hand right now, and that's what we call water bottle, right? Um, and I think almost the exact same thing happens for ethics, where it's like, hey, we have these things that we want to happen for whatever reason we want them. We want these things to happen, and there is a best way of achieving that, and that's through like a non-contradictory system built on what little information we can grab from reality about how to effectively organize this way. And I get to ethics through their consent specifically through that means. And so it's funny that we've kind of like gone the circle, and it seems like once again we're kind of mirroring each other's positions, but one of us is committing to a moral realist position. And I feel like maybe this is just a pragmatic consideration for a moment, considering the fact that we're able to use similar, though not identical, means of reaching a similar end, which I see as validating for both of our conclusions, whether or not our way of getting there is different. Um, is there not like a pragmatic consideration that like, hey, the one that requires you to take the least epistemic or ontological commitments towards like a moral realism is, there's good reason that you might want to go for that one instead?
Right. So interesting. Like Occam's razor is against ethical realism. I actually think Occam's razor is on the side of ethical realism or moral realism, or words fail me. Um, yeah. So when you have a whole bunch of disparate things that are all explained by the same general thing, then I think that it's simpler to say that that broader concept is correct rather than to say that there was a whole lot of coincidences that happened to align with this general concept. I think that there is some reasonable disagreement about morality, but there's reasonable disagreement about everything, and so the amount of concordance, which is quite a lot, right? Like, it is true that between different cultures we have large differences, but then again, we have larger differences between cultures about epistemic beliefs. But there are a lot of common threads, right? With morality throughout human history, it's not random, right? We're not just seeing if there was no underlying thing that is pulling them in the same direction, then we would expect it to just be, oh, well, this society thinks that you should just always murder all the time. Just if you're not murdering right now, then you're bad. And they've been pretty warlike cultures, but they've all had, like, at least some people you shouldn't murder, right? Um, and so it's not a random distribution of moral beliefs across the world. It is things that seem to be centered around something, and I think that what we're doing when we do moral reasoning is we're figuring out the mistakes. Like, we can point to specific moral beliefs and find the specific mistakes that resulted in them, like I did with the roof throwers. Um, and what we're doing is we're simplifying down to the general rules that seem to best explain the consistency that we do have with moral intuitions.
So, from your perspective, does a position of phenomenal conservative or moral well, just for just this question, phenomenal conservatism specifically, does that preclude you from making like a kind of knowledge claim? So like typical, just for anybody who isn't aware, classical epistemology is separated typically into like they would separate out intuition from belief from knowledge, and there's layers of justification and truth that are supposed to help you get between these different levels, like an escalator or something. If you have one, you get to pass go, collect $200 sort of deal. Uh, is that is belief the end in phenomenal conservatism as you understand it?
So my understanding of oh, I think I've just lost my Discord. Sorry, everyone. Please bear with us. Technical difficulties and all that. Just in case you can still hear me, which I think you can, we're just rebooting Discord. So yeah, just in the meantime, just ponder what you've heard and maybe come to your own conclusions and other time-filling nonsense that I'm going to say while I reboot Discord. Indeed. For sure. My computer is way too slow. It has been an interesting conversation. And yeah, thank you, Casimir Freeman. You can still hear me, but not see me. Yes. Yes, we will be back together in just a moment. Just loading up Discord. Okay. Can you hear me again?
I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, we just lost Discord. Fortunately, the stream didn't end, so we won't have to like start a new stream. But everyone's just had a nice little break from there to think about what they've heard. Like, let's pretend that that was planned. Let me get my camera
Right.
on again. Okay, now I'm just gonna check to see if the live stream has got us back on. Yeah, it all seems to be good. Okay, so coming back to where we were, can you refresh my memory? I believe you just said a thing.
Okay. It kind of. I'm not gonna lie. I got really. My train of thought got really derailed there for a second. But Um. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the last thing I was talking about was no. It was. Was it the Occam's razor of moral
Oh,
realism?
yes, I think I was actually. Yeah, okay, so I just sort of explained that I think that there is. Human beliefs about morality may have some disagreement, but all beliefs have disagreement. However, there is some consistency to them, right? They're not random. If we just picked a random set of possible moral beliefs, it would look very different from the set of moral beliefs that people actually have had and have throughout societies and cultures across the world. And that consistency can just be explained by certain things actually being moral and immoral. Now, what counts, I was also including in that what counts as moral and immoral is usually a bunch of the same things, right? It's usually the same thing is evolutionarily adaptive for a society and fulfills human values that pertain to other values and a whole bunch of other things that you could think of as morality, right? That a lot of things will satisfy all of those definitions. However, some things like will only satisfy one of them, and those things, just as it can be a little bit difficult to determine whether the ship of thesis is still the ship of thesis, it can be a little bit difficult to determine which ones we should refer to as actual morality and not, because morality is something that is usually a bunch of different things that are usually travel together, but they don't have to always for it to be a useful concept.
Okay, yeah. And I think I asked you about phenomenal conservatism and knowledge claims, but I'd also there's something that you brought up to me that was brought up just then, and I want to make sure I don't understand you, but I'll do it in the form of a question. Um, you brought up this idea of the composite structure of morality, and I like that a lot. Like I said earlier, um, where is the ought in the observation of these composite structure, like say the evolutionary behavioral characteristics you were talking about earlier? Um, Not to go too deep into Hume just yet. From that, it seems to be the case that if we're going to commit ourselves to a moral realist position, that moral realist position is like a true ought. And how do we get this ought from? And I think you might say seemings, but not to get too far ahead. But how do we get this ought from these observations of what I think we could say are, we're observing behavioral characteristics in humans and what they want and don't want, etc.
When I say ought, I mean something will fulfill a certain goal, or will achieve a certain goal. So, for example, it whether or not you when you say ought, like you ought to do X, there's an implied in order to achieve Y. Um,
I completely agree. Yeah.
yeah. So if I say you ought to throw yourself off a building, I don't know why I'm having more building throws. That's another thing you wouldn't do. You should stand on your head on a table holding $1 million bill between your toes. You to say you should do that in order to seem ridiculous, right? That is sort of like an implied thing. And whether or not that does actually comport with values that you hold, it is true, right? That you really ought to do that in order to achieve that goal. When we don't specify what we ought to be doing something in order to achieve, I think in those situations, there can be different implied ones, but usually, or at least a lot of the time, it's in order to fulfill values that you hold. And when we're talking about morality, I think that what we're saying is in order to be moral. And then you're just going to have to go into a definition of what it is to be moral. So when I say, in most contexts, like I like sort of pseudo utilitarian, I guess, like a first person utilitarian view where you're trying to fulfill values that you have that pertain to other values. It is true that you ought to value consent in order to fulfill those, what I like to call meta values, right? Values that pertain to other values. It is just factually the case that you do care about whether other people live or die. It is just factually the case that you care about their values to some degree. Not equally, like I'm not going egalitarian here, but you just do care about other people's values to some amount. And there is some sensible way of achieving the goal of optimally fulfilling those meta values, those values that pertain to other values. And so it is that's why a moral statement using this idea of morality is objective, right? It is either the case that you will or will not achieve that goal via taking this action. So something is objectively moral or immoral. I need to make sure I make clear that this isn't to say that that's all of morality. Like I say, there's a bunch of things that we kind of call morality that usually travel together, but most of them seem pretty objective. And the one that I really like in a lot of circumstances, the meta value fulfillment strategies kind of morality, is pretty objective.
This is not at all how I expected this conversation to go, because the more we talk, the more I think we agree on like a lot of how morality functions, except for this seeming on whether or not it is like some moral realist position that we're forwarding versus like process optimization. So like the example I usually give is I view ethics in a similar way that I would view a factory. You can lay out a factory in basically any way you want as long as, it does the job of a factory by definition. But there is a best way for process efficiency to lay out a factory. And so that's kind of how I and Patrick, the co-author for the manifesto, went about looking at, yeah. And I think we agree 100% on that. But I think where the only place where we would disagree is how we would label the factory, right? Like you would commit yourself to saying like, hey, this is a factual good that this factory is laid out in this highly efficient process. And I would just say, well, it's not good. It's just the best way to do it. There's nothing particularly special about it other than they had reasons independent of any sort of fact to do that.
Can I just pause you there? Because something bothered me
Go
a little
for it.
bit. Maybe it was a phrasing thing, or maybe I'm not understanding what you're saying. But you said it's not good, it's just the best way.
Yeah,
Best
I think
means
there's a big
most
difference
good.
there. I
Best
don't
means.
think best does mean most good.
Oh.
I think I think we could say that uh like there's a best writing utensil for taking notes, in that the mechanical pencil is superior because you don't have to like throw it away after, and the lead is super cheap and you can refill it, etc. Yada yada. I'm just making up a scenario here. You can object to that, but I really like using pens, and so I'm going to use a pen. And I'm not going to say that the person who uses a pen is bad, and I'm not going to say the person who uses a mechanical is good. One of them is concerned with process efficiency, and they have very good reasons for doing that, and the other one doesn't. And there's probably nothing I can ever say to change that other than give them a really nice mechanical pencil or give me a pen or something like that, you
Okay,
know?
I totally get the my confusion there. All right, so when you were saying it's not uh, it's not good, it's best. You were saying best with you're saying good in terms of morality and best in terms of some other goal, right? Some other hypothetical goal.
Process
So
efficiency in this
process
case, yeah.
efficiency, sure. And that's why I'd say I think best is most good, but it's most good at the relevant category, right? It's most good at process efficiency, and but I do agree that yeah, obviously, best at process efficiency is not best morally, or most good at process efficiency is not most good morally. So those are definitely different things. But I, I, I guess the question is whether process efficiency and morality are similar things. I think they are. I think that there is an objective answer as to what has best process efficiency, and is similarly an objective answer as to what is most moral. I think they're different goals, and they will have different answers, and that's fine.
Yeah, I something that I've been trying to do recently is I've been reading a lot of old German people for some reason because I kind of like them. They're fun. They're actually super depressing most of the time. But I've been reading a lot of Nietzsche, and something that he talks about that's really been resonating with me is this idea of like condemning the morally bad, right? And he's like, look, some people are just like rabid animals, and it's like you're not gonna like you know, he says it in very plain ways. Like some people are just not going to be able to engage peacefully, and like why are you working yourself up into knots with talking about how bad you ought to condemn them? Everybody else is fine, most of them anyways. They may make some mistakes, and I think that's kind of like an attitude that I'm trying to take more, is to have not an apathy, but like a more grounded perspective on some of these things, in the sense that because I believe that the selection of an ethical theory is arbitrary, and because I believe that there isn't any sort of external compulsion that I can lean on in order to say, you must be this way, I think there are plenty of good reasons why you should act this way, but I cannot say you must. There's like it kind of takes the edge off a little bit. It does. I don't think it
Hmm.
makes it any less important, because I think the good reasons to do so are can be just actually, I think they're the exact same as the must. They've just been called must this whole time. And and the must language doesn't accurately speak to whatever I think is going on. So like what this is a super boiled down version, but basically the idea is like, hey, look, you don't want to engage with me consensually? Okay, people do that all the time. I guess we fight now. You know, I mean, that's where we're at. It's like, okay, we have no ethical basis to engage with each other. You don't want to consent with me at all. We just fight. We just do the same thing wolves and foxes and lions and bears do. I don't want to do that. You brought this on to both of us. So let's go. Um, and I don't know if this like 100% directly gets at what you're getting at, but you know, this is more, I think, to say that like I think maybe that's a bit of a of an angle that in reflection that I can take, because I don't hold like a moral realist view of the importance of the factual nature of this good. but at the same time, I don't feel like it really lands us in any different of a situation. We both come to the same kind of place at the end of the day, maybe with slightly different language involved. So again, this has just been very interesting for that reason alone. I expected us to clash much more on some of these like actual ethical commitments, but if anything, at this point, I almost feel comfortable enough calling it like a disagreement in language. Like it's so similar at this point that I'm like, maybe we are just talking about the same thing, and or maybe it is just a difference in seeming, and we are talking about the same thing. It just seems different to us, and maybe there is no way to overcome that. You know? Um,
Maybe it is. Yeah, maybe it's all just the difference of language. I do find that I do, however, think that I understand the impulse to call it an anti-realist position, and I have issues with that. I have a very similar thing with debates about consciousness or free will, where it seems to me that um, there have been so many language games played for so long that what I think is the situation is that anyone who is attempting to use the language simply and coherently is going to seem like they're the one playing the language games. Um, and so I think that it's the simple and coherent understanding of it is that there's a bunch of different standards that we're analyzing um, that usually are the same thing, so we call them all morality as a collective thing. Uh, it is a real thing, just the same way as any object, like all objects are composites of other objects, right? Is the same way as an object is real, the same way as a process is real. There's objectively true and false answers about it. Um, it's obvious to anyone who talks about it that you're having a moral conversation, right? If I just start talking about maximizing the fulfillment of different people's values and I call that morality, and you just come along and say no, it isn't. It seems like I'm not the one playing language games, and yet there's an objective answer to it. Uh, I don't know what it would mean for there to be a morality that's more real than that. It's not that I think that morality isn't more real than that. It's that I don't know what it would even mean to say that morality is more real than that. What's more real than that? That's as real as literally anything I know of. Um, and yeah, I have the same sort of view about free will. It's like, well, like free will is as real as anything, or the consciousness and things like that. It's just like we shouldn't. It's almost as though the explanation a long time ago was that the thing is magic and you shouldn't question it. And so now, if anyone who has something that isn't magic and can be questioned, just gets told that that thing that they're talking about isn't the thing we were talking about before, when it really seems as though it is.
it's actually, I think it's probably a good thing that you brought up like your free will discussion. I think that's to be fair, I haven't seen this video in a while, but if I remember, essentially your argument boils down to the fact that like, hey, this conversation is dumb. We seem to have like an imminent experience that we could choose things. Is that determined? Is that like wholly causally free? Who cares? We can choose things. Is that fair enough? At
um,
least for a brief summary.
well, like no, it's more like I don't know what causally free means. Is kind of the answer. It's that like people seem really upset by not having free will, and it's like, oh well, I couldn't have done anything else, and it's like, yeah, but yeah, you could have. And it's like, well, but I'm still constrained by the laws of physics. And it's like, well, you are like an aspect of the laws of physics. That's what you are. You did choose that, right? It's like the example I use is like a billiard ball. Now, billiard balls don't choose because they're not a structure like a human brain, but nonetheless, they do cause things, right? A billiard ball hits into another billiard ball, and it causes that other billiard ball to move. And you might say, well, no, but it was just hit by the cue, so it didn't cause the other billiard ball to move. And it's like, well, okay, but you can then say that about the cue, and then nothing causes anything. This is silly. Like, no, the cue caused the billiard ball to move. That billiard ball caused another billiard ball to move. It seems simple to me. And similarly, you caused the things that you choose to happen. And the mental process that is, amenable to incentives and weighs considerations, that's a choosing thing, right? So your choice structure in your brain or whatever caused the thing. So it seems to me sensible to say you chose it.
Right. Okay. That's what I was trying to communicate with my thing. So
Gotcha.
if anybody didn't get that from what I said, just copy paste what he said. So um the so like with that same sort of perspective in mind, I think the label of moral realism, and this might seem a little strong, but I think even as humor uses it, and this is probably a fault on my part for projecting too much onto you, someone else's views who are very similar. Um, I think humor seems a lot more committed to talk about moral realism as like what people were actually talking about this whole time versus what and this is like a charge that I've brought against moral realists before, right? I've made admittedly like incomprehensibly wild things that I think would like prove an objective morality to me, where it's like, yeah, just find the particle with the good spin, find the one with the bad spin, and we'll use our good and bad detectors to figure everything out. Obviously, that's never going to happen. And I'm not saying it to be facetious. Well,
Yeah, I think it's
go
more that
ahead. Yeah,
it's more than it won't happen. It's that that doesn't make any sense. If you do find the particle with the good
exactly.
and bad spin, then you're not talking about morality. Like, that's not what morality is. It's not the spin of a particle.
Right. And so, well, I think there's, yeah, I mean, d- I don't want to get too bogged down onto this. There's actually a paper, and I wish I could remember her name. It's Sarah. She makes a case for how there could be a physicalist grounding for morality, and it's essentially like the good waves, and we just don't have the good wave detectors yet. And it's like it's confirmation. It's not morality. It's an effect of morality. So it would be like this good wave comes off whenever good things happen. It's an effect of kind of like how you know gravity is effective relation of two bodies of mass. It is not mass, but it indicates that there is some relation to mass. Totally off topic. I'm sorry. Um, but I think this is good because I whether or not I like to admit it, there are a lot of people who commit themselves to positions like that, where there is some kind of like in the fabric of reality, in nature, guiding stone of morality. But that's not at all what your moral realism is even indicating at. You're looking at it much more from a perspective that I would. And whether or not we disagree on whether that is or is not moral realism is honestly to me at this point not a supermassive concern just because of how much we actually agree on. Usually with moral realists, we have like real strong natural law types. We have fundamental disagreements on what it is to be a moral system, to be good, to be bad. What do these words mean? What are they indicating? What are they pointing at? Like a Rothbardian, for example, very very different views, and he is a moral realist, um, and but it's a completely different kind than the kind that at least your version of ethical intuitionism is committing yourself to, and one that I think whether or not I wind up being convinced after thinking about this conversation more, one that I at the very least find a non-offensive, the only perhaps non-offensive moral realist position I've seen. So
Gotcha. Yes. I do like that we've ended up with an enormous amount of disagreement. I think enormous amount of agreement, but my disagreement with other self-proclaimed moral realists might be interesting way to think about it. Is that I think that the point I made about the particles, like the spin of the particles, that's not morality. That leads me to my response to a lot of the people who say, "Oh, well, like there's moral waves or something like that." It's that you're not like that's not morality. Like you're not. That is not a moral realist position. That is a position about the existence of a wave that you're just arbitrarily calling morality and confusing the discussion. Right?
right,
Morality is this way of analyzing human behavior that that involves a bunch of different ways of analyzing it, but they're largely concordant. That's what it
right,
is. And if you start talking about a different thing, that's not what it is. That's not. I don't have a reason to care about that. Like, if there was a wave, the idea that they often have is, oh, if there's a morality wave, then I could show you that there's an objective reason to care about it. No, No, then there's not an objective reason to care about it. Only with morality as this way of analyzing human behavior that is embedded in our values to some degree, only then do we have a reason to actually be moral, an objective reason to follow this real existent thing, right? If the people talking about waves and stuff, that's are correct, and that's morality, then we objectively don't have any reason to follow morality. Like their argument gets the opposite of the conclusion that they're looking for, and that's, I think, the correct response to those people is not that no, morality isn't real because there isn't this wave. It's no, morality is real, and if there was that wave and you called it morality, that would be a language game. It's not.
Right. Okay. I think, yeah, like I said, I've used those examples kind of facetiously to point out, the fact that it's a silly way of thinking about it, and yet what a lot of people I think are trying to appeal to, whether or not they realize it. But yeah, I mean, I think there are we could probably, if you wanted to, we could probably dig more in kind of go back and dig into the epistemology. But I mean, I had I wouldn't say vastly, but I had a much different impression of the kind of commitments that I thought phenomenal conservatism and moral intuitionism would almost require. But I think you've convinced me that that's not the case, as far as like committing yourself to some ontologically real moral essence, or something of the other like that, or committing some sort of like deep naturalistic fallacy or something else. And that's good, if nothing else, from this conversation. And but yeah,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
guess that's my
Yeah, I'll wrap up as well. So I guess I think that we've kind of gone through the bulk of this conversation. It would be interesting if we can do another one where hopefully I can get these video issues figured out. By the way, this is so many video issues. This may as well have been a podcast at this point. If anyone getting any enjoyment out of it will just be listening to it. That it just, yeah. So apologies about that. But I did find it a very fascinating conversation. Your position is not as tied to, like, I would guess, entry level skeptic philosophy as I thought it might be. There's yeah, it doesn't seem as I don't know if at the end of this if I'd call you a philosophical skeptic. It seems unclear. I guess that's a discussion for another time. But yeah, my impression of your view is a little bit different than it was going in, and I think that would probably need another couple of conversations to talk about that. Before we get out, I don't know if you've been looking at the chat. Have there been any things in there that you wanted to touch on or respond to?
There's one question from Casimir. Hey, buddy, how's it going? Haven't talked in a while. Question, Christian M. Are you distinct from reality except as a pattern? Are your opinions distinct from reality as causality? So no, I don't think so. And I also have kind of developed into a position where I don't think it matters. I think the answer is no, and that I have a reflective capacity for this thing that I call choices, and that's all I need for literally everything else. So that's there's a lot more I could say on that. I talked with, there's probably a little bit of this is coming up with, I had a conversation with Liquid Zulu, I think a few months ago now, regarding are we free? Are we not free? And it's a fun conversation I like to have. But I think the position I've been taking as of late is I don't see any reason to appeal or commit myself towards any kind of free will, because I don't need to, because I have this reflective capacity and a thing I call choice, and that's all I need for ethics, and that's all I need to interact with other people, and that's kind of where I'm at with it. So
Gotcha. Okay. I had one thing that I wanted to respond to from the chat, which was Patrick Smith jumped in a little bit earlier and said, you're completely 100% right, but I don't like talking about it like that. It seems more like a troll than a pro-free will position. It would, if that was my position, Patrick. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that just to really quickly get into my beef with people who are opposed to the existence of free will and call themselves determinists, I think that what is actually happening is you are switching definitions of free will and not realizing that you're doing it. That you will use a definition of free will that is contradictory with determinism when deciding whether free will exists, and then you will switch to one that is actually compatible with determinism when you're deciding what the implications of that are. And in my video on it, I catch Sam Harris very clearly doing this, where he's saying that we don't have free will, and therefore we should treat people more kindly when they do bad things because they didn't really have the choice to do that. And it's like, no, that conclusion would require a incentive receiving version of free will, which is completely compatible with determinism. So yeah, my position is not that the determinism is correct, therefore free will is wrong. People is not that they are 100% right. I think that they are doing an accidental equivocation thing that they don't realize they're doing. Okay. Anything else in the chat you wanted to hit on before we get going?
I honestly, I wasn't keeping up too much during the actual conversation just because we were talking back and forth. But yeah, I mean, maybe. Oh, I think we still have a list of. Oh, sorry, that was something else. I don't know. Maybe if someone is in the Discord or something, they could throw some questions and maybe we could answer them like that or something. If anybody has.
Okay. I'll quickly jump into the Discord there, but I think.
Oh, I didn't mean to commit you to something.
No, it's all good. We don't seem to have anything in the Discord either, so I guess we'll have to call it there. But we definitely should do another one, maybe with Patrick as well, seeing as how he was kind of jumping in there in the chat, and that seemed very interesting. So yeah, had a great time. Thank you.
Yep.